Hi, I'm Daz Greenwood, a lecturer at the MIT Media Lab, and this is a brief demo of a new approach we're working on for a personalized control panel, a dashboard, basically, for individuals to control their personal data and also use of their identity. This is part of a research initiative through the MIT Media Lab that is associated with open source code known as OpenPDS. That's short for Personal Data Store. This part of the project explores some of the legal elements of personal data and individual identity control. By way of background, the user terms of service, which are so typical on websites and online services today, along with the privacy policies, clearly has not succeeded in achieving the intended goals of a not only enforceable agreement, but also one that is sufficiently efficient and reflective of the business deal between consumers and service providers. And it's frankly broken. Notice and consent has not worked, and new paradigms are needed. Now, to individually negotiate all of the terms of every contract between a mass market service provider or application provider and every individual consumer, of course, is also infeasible. However, by a better adapted use of Web 2.0 technology and claims-based tokenized permission standards, in particular OAuth 2 and its progeny, it is possible to combine commercial, as in business, legal, and technical code for a integrated, rules-driven, user-controlled solution. And big data, the promise of personal data, the promise of the information revolution really requires that there be better solutions that do, in effect, enable user control and also, at the same time, make available big data analytics and large-scale usage of information, and yet not in a way that breaks the deal, that breaches the social compact that respects individual autonomy and sovereignty, some individual freedom and liberty with respect to one's personal effects, one's set of data that a person owns. A way to get there is by leveraging a foundational aspect of the OAuth 2 protocol, and it is the grant of authorization that drives the user consent to access of some resource of that user's that can be extrapolated and, in a somewhat more refined and customized way, adapted to serve a much deeper purpose of building a well-aligned architecture supporting and reflecting user control and ownership. For example, by connecting the apps screen that is very typical on a web service that supports OAuth 2 with the terms of service, which are also typical, but at this point all but unconnected, it is possible to create a new type of user contract, a new kind of user dashboard for the exercise of the individual's right to either protect or to grant access and downstream sharing to their data. Let's take a look at how a good example of the user account page based on Twitter could be reconceptualized to provide a demonstration of this concept. So here is my profile page on Twitter. It's my account page. And as you can see down the left side, there's a number of basically options that one has to look at the account, password management, your notifications, and so forth. And way down there at the bottom, disconnected, are the terms of service and the privacy. What if and then if you click on apps, one of the options near the bottom, just above widgets, you can see the apps that, in this case, at that point, I had provisioned access to an authorized, basically granted authorization to connect with my personal data and account at Twitter. So Banjo, basically archiving service called Memolane, some YouTube services, and so forth. Now, here's an example of the terms of service. If you click on that link, you get this sort of HTML page. What if instead there was something like, let's call it terms of authorization? If you kind of see up there this new little link I've created, just mocked it up here, called terms of authorization. If there was something of that nature, when a user, instead of clicking on terms of service and seeing the typical terms of service, and an apps page and seeing the apps they've granted access to their data for, if there was a terms of authorization that combined the information that is part of the apps management page, so you can see the parties, Banjo and YouTube, etc., that have been granted access by the user, and the access that's been granted: read, write, post to my timeline, create a new Evernote, access something in Dropbox, etc. Those actually can very well be understood and construed as contract terms. We know the parties, we know the transactions, we can see clearly what the rights and obligations are with respect to the scopes of access to the defined resources. They could actually be literally part of the terms of service. Instead, you might think of them as terms of authorization. So here's, in this little wireframe, an example where maybe some paragraphs of typical, we agree to use the service, some other basic terms, and then somewhere further down the page you can imagine a new section called Terms of Authorization, where it lists these additional parties. And very importantly, those grants of authorization can be revoked. They can also easily be modified so that some authorizations are expanded, others may be deleted or constrained in some way. The OAuth 2 protocol very easily permits this type of more granular control, and some services and implementations of OAuth 2 very adeptly permit that. So the basic concept here of integrating the user contracts with these dynamically generated and user-controlled additional terms that involve and actually literally incorporate the additional parties and their rights and obligations with respect to access to the user's resources, and in this case their personal data, is being called IAuth. It rests upon the, I think, very successful foundations of OAuth 2, which has recently been formalized at last by the Internet Engineering Task Force. But unlike the initial, more shall we say, industry and developer focus of the open standard, that is OAuth. This is a individually focused and human-centered initiative looking at things from the perspective of that individual that grants authorization, that individual that owns their own data, the individual whose identity it is that a federated credential is authenticating and permitting broader reusable third-party access and login with. The I of IAuth is the individual themselves, and the perspective of IAuth is the perspective of that individual. And by more closely aligning and then harmonizing and finally integrating business, legal, and technical dimensions of the implementation of OAuth 2 by a closer attention to the types of scopes and some standardization, at least service by service, of those scopes, such that the individual users and the external service and application providers that have been permitted the access tokens to connect their services with that user's data have a clear understanding of what the scope and application of those defined scopes are, and they also explicitly have that reflected and supported within the contract, so that the contract becomes a dynamic instrument of control and agreement, not only for ensuring that one's personal data is secure and not accessed, but also, even more importantly, in the interconnected world of the networked web, that it can be shared, and the conditions of the sharing are more explicit and directly part of the contract, which is really part of a dashboard that has controls where you can display all of the parties at any given time, not locked in a apps management window, but literally part of the deal, and you can modify and manage and update those controls from time to time. So the next steps with this concept are to further explore it and actually begin rolling our sleeves up at MIT by doing a hackathon. And so in this case, it's not just a hackathon of computer code, but it's actually a legal hackathon. And it's part of a broader MIT hackathon that's happening in the last week of January, January 28th to February 1st, where many people will be developing apps for the OpenPDS software. And this legal track is going to be focusing on this underlying code base we're calling IAuth at this point, and will really be focused on a combination of legal and policy, as well as business, marketing, economic, and also technical standards and profiles, configurations, usage of the particular way of implementing the types of scope, the definitions of the resources, and the integration of those grants of authorization right back into the basic agreement within a dashboard, within a user open account module, within, if you will, an identity embassy and will be contributing the code that comes out of this right back into the open source OpenPDS project, and we'll also be continuing the academic and research and development work on this through the 2012 and 2013 calendar year and in our next semester. And I hope if you're interested in this that you will take a closer look and join us in person. You can apply. There's limited space, but it is possible to join us in person, but really online. Wherever you are in the world, you can participate. You can collaborate in the concurrent development of this concept, instantiated in working code and prototyped in models of business, legal, and technical integrated architectures that are going to be freely available under Creative Commons and open source licenses. And you can register to participate at IAuth.eventbrite.com. The URL is right here on the bottom of the screen, IAuth.eventbrite.com. And to keep tabs on the project and how it develops over time, feel free to come by ecitizen.mit.edu, and more information on this particular approach is on a blog post at that site, just /MIT-legal-hack-a-thon, legal hackathon. And so it's a call for participation. If there's something in here that you think has promise, if there's an idea you have that you think would be a valuable contribution and that you'd like to share and are willing to make freely available under our open licensing, join us and help to develop the type of open architecture and the kinds of civic, public infrastructures that our economy and society require as we move into this digital era. Be an e-citizen and help create the environment within which e-citizens of the future can thrive.